When it comes to the most important wars in US history, what comes to mind? Your average American would say the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War II, and to some people, Vietnam. But when it comes to the First World War, not many Americans remember World War I and its significance, despite being the third largest conflict in American history, as well as shaping much of what America is today. So why is that the case? When you think of the most popular war movies, you have Saving Private Ryan, Full Metal Jacket, Gettysburg, and so many more that I cannot list. This does not include TV, video games, and other forms of media. But what they all have in common is they mostly take place in the Second World War, a good amount in Vietnam, and a small but respectable number in the Civil War and American Revolution. But in the case of World War I, however, there is very little modern media representation, at least in America, and the media that does take place during World War I comes from the UK, with the most recent wide-release movie in America being 1917, which came out this year. For those who didn't see it, I highly recommend you do so. Even then, it's not very often you see World War I represented in popular media, let alone from the American perspective. But why? There are two main reasons. One is narrative. With World War II, it's generally viewed as a war against good and evil. Same goes to the Civil War and American Revolution, as they both follow the same formula. Vietnam is a big complex, but the motivation behind it does follow the good guy bad guy narrative, at least on paper. Not to mention that these wars are ideological in nature. This makes it convenient for filmmakers to make a movie out of that said time period, as the motivations are set in place. With World War I, it's less about ideology and more about competition between the great powers of Europe, which eventually led to the First World War. As for the war itself, there are no clear good or bad guys, as World War I is characterized as a war for survival. Look at a typical World War I battlefield and compare it to a World War II battlefield. I think World War I best demonstrates the horrors of war, which is why many films that take place during the First World War are anti-war in nature. Second, the amount of time America was involved in World War I. From its entry in April 1917 to the armistice in November 1918, America's involvement lasted for 583 days, of which 200 days was spent in combat. Not to mention that 3/4 of American combat deaths occurred after August 9th. In short, there is not that much material to be made. Despite America's short involvement, why America's entry in World War I important? Firstly, America's entry was a huge morale booster for both the French and British armies, as during this time, France experienced a mutiny after suffering heavy casualties during the first 3 years of war, with Britain also facing a similar situation. With Russia out of the war, both France and Britain have to face 3.5 million Germans with absolute artillery superiority against 2.5 million demoralized British and French. Even before America's entry, America loaned billions of dollars and supplied arms to both Britain and France, and with Germany unable to trade with the US due to the British blockade, Germany resorted to sabotage, which eventually led to the US joining the war against Germany. In short, had America not intervened, the war would have lasted much longer, possibly in a German victory. With that said, what is World War I's impact on America? Firstly, it marked the beginning of America's position as a global superpower, as President Woodrow Wilson sought to make peace between European powers through the League of Nations. Although Wilson wasn't able to convince the US Senate to join the League of Nations, his rhetoric of self-determination influenced many anti-colonial movements throughout the world. With many men fighting overseas, women had to take over the jobs that were previously exclusive for men, either in factories or in the medical field, which their contributions eventually allowed women to vote in 1920. Lastly, World War I also sparked the beginning of the civil rights movement, with many African American soldiers who served in World War I demanding civil rights at home. In conclusion, there is no denying that World War I's impact on America was significant. Although its involvement is not as notable as other major US conflicts, its impact cannot be understated, considering that World War I helped shape modern America, as well as influence other countries abroad. And with BF1 in 1917 giving World War I more exposure to the general public with great success, there is a chance for hope, as only through popular media will the war be remembered by future generations. Well, happy Veterans Day to all you guys, and remember your World War I.
Goodbye, New York town, goodbye, Miss Liberty. Your light of freedom will guide us across the sea. Every soldier's dream.
Schön war die Zeit für uns in Afrika, doch diese Zeit ist lange her.